Alright everyone, now it's time for another occult literature video, a second compilation I've made following hot on the heels of demonology. This compilation about alchemy. It's 366 pages, link in the description to where you can find it on Amazon. The second and third links there will be to my books blogs. If you're interested in alchemy, there is a whole section of that. This basically, I wanted to create a compilation of full-length and re-edited, reformatted works on alchemy, improving them. There were a few grammatical errors in a few of them, but by and large they were actually pretty clean when I went through them the second time. 14 different works, full length on alchemy. So you've got like a work of Saturn by Hollandus, you've got the Golden Chain of Homer. I was going to initially include the Turba as potentially the most important work, other than maybe the Rosary of the Philosophers. That's long enough so that I didn't want to include it for length purposes. Now, I was going to include the Turba, but then I realized that actually it's so heavily mentioned in several of the other works that I did include. I think it was Book of the Chemical Art was one of them, Stone of the Philosophers by Kelly. It's alluded to so often that a large proportion of the work is quoted there anyway. And basically what I wanted to do with this, I created an expansive preface explaining the works, explaining the basic concept of alchemy. I threw in an appendix for the inclusions of non-full-length works. I included a short bibliography of more modern works that one can consult. Stuff from, the last century and a half as opposed to things from the 17th century. And then also a simple list of terms just to explain some of the more frequently used obtuse terms within alchemy. Talking about some of the equipment, some of the materials, the Paracelsian term of salt, mercury, and sulfur versus the actual materials as we know them now. I wanted to sort of explain that. You can also look up additional information on the internet. Alchemy texts are all over the place. But I wanted to include this for people who are interested in a more fleshed out, I think, study of the topic. And so what I tried to do was I tried to include texts that are more literal and texts that are more symbolic, because one thing within alchemy that fascinates me is in some cases the juxtaposition, the interposition of metaphor in the philosophical sense, the spiritual side, and then the chemical. So you'll have some works that are very explicit, like Ever-Burning Lights of Trithemius is literally a science experiment. It's also only 3 pages long. Essentially, you're creating a luminous substance that glows in the dark, and it's considered an ever-burning light. Now, of course, today, we do acknowledge that this sort of thing can happen. Those little glow-in-the-dark stars that every kid had on their ceiling in their bedroom in the 1990s and in the 2000s, those operate on a similar principle, and it's not 100% sure what particular compounds that sometimes are being spoken of in some of these works. To be clear, I do not recommend attempting to create a solution with lead, sweet elixir, and pumping it into wounds. I officially disavow using lead as medicine. Generally speaking, that's not done these days. Working with antimony is dangerous. Working with mercury even more so. But these chemical processes in some cases are also richly veiled in metaphor. And it's actually extremely interesting because there's like a whole language of alchemy that people would have understood only if they were studying with the alchemist. So they would wrap it up in like angelic script. They would talk about spirits. They would talk about angels. They would use terms like green lion and black crow and stuff like this, and talk about enlightenment or ascension and stuff. And then they're talking about chemical processes. They're talking about the vapors rising up, being cooled then off, being decanted in this way, and so forth. It's quite interesting as a subject. It can be confusing. I don't recommend actually attempting to do any of the chemical experiments in these works. And it also ties in a little bit with folk medicine, because in some of these cases, the stone of the philosophers that's being created as an elixir, as a medicine, it's a chemical compound, but different alchemists were creating different things. And so one was making a solution of lead, another one was making a sulfurous compound. And so when you use the term stone of the philosophers, technically speaking, you're not speaking about a singular substance. You are technically speaking about a singular idea when you're trying to talk about the projection of metals, like literally turning things into gold or increasing your gold or something. That's one thing. But the actual stone of the philosophers literally being spoken of in several works is medicine. It's a chemical preparation. It's extremely fascinating, and it's again, it can be a little bit difficult to understand. This work is mainly a historical primer. And so I included what I thought was appropriate to illustrate the basic concept of the text, which is categorizing the different alchemical works according to how literal or metaphoric they are. Are they more on the philosophical or physical side, essentially, as well as just to give a broad overview of the subject in these 14 different works. Again, 366 pages in length, so this is another full-length work like the demonological one I just released. Link in the description of this video cross-platform. I'll also pin a comment on YouTube for ease of use, I suppose. Definitely highly recommended for those of you who like alchemy. I've edited all of these works myself. That's about all. Peace out.